Namaste and greetings. I, Swati Solanki, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान नई दिल्ली, extend my warm welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered for a special talk on practitioner reflections on the data and evidence ecosystem as a part of the series, The State of Statistics #Data Discourses. The series is organized by Generation Alpha Data Center at IMPRI. It is my privilege to introduce the chair for our session, PC Mohanan, who is former acting chairperson, National Statistical Commission, Government of India. Our eminent speaker for today's talk is Abhirup Bhunia. Sir is an independent development practitioner and supports evidence-based decision-making through research and monitoring, evaluation, and learning. He has worked closely with bilateral and multilateral donor agencies, the private sector, and governments in various developmental sectors, covering a diverse range of policy matters. He is a master's from the University of Sussex, UK. Now, I request the chair of our session, PC Mohanan, to take our discussion forward. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Swati, and let me welcome Arup and all the others, and express my happiness that the Institute IMPRI is organizing this, initiated this dialogue, series of dialogues, and I think the third one I'm probably listening to, and so that is a very welcome step, especially in the current situation when data has taken the center stage in all debates and all discussions, especially in the last 1 or 2 years we have seen, for a variety of reasons, once you can say. And in fact, I think most of you may be aware that the World Development Report of the World Bank this year is actually on data for better lives. That is the title of the report. And that covers a very wide spectrum of issues. And I think some of the things are very relevant in the current context. The WDR was initiated much before the COVID pandemic, but the pandemic has made the issues relating to data much more important, much more serious to be taken by almost everybody. And all along we have been worried about data for a variety of reasons, either the darker side, or the data would violate your privacy, or it might be used for surveillance, or it may be used for making profits by some unscrupulous people. There is another one side, and the other brighter side is all of us know that data can improve the government policies, discussions, and discourses, and also help people to make improved, better choices in all issues. So there are both the bright and the dark side that has been in the discussion all along. And we also had a data protection bill which has been debated for some time. One good thing I've seen is that, especially in the last 1 year, the data has been is being taken up for discussion almost on an hourly basis, you can say. When I started looking or studying the government statistics about 40 years back, or I never thought the issues like the civil registration system or the sample registration system or the medical certification of cause of death statistics, I never thought these statistics would ever be discussed in a public journal or newspapers. But now every day, this is the only thing you find, people trying to estimate the excess death using this civil registration or the sample registration and other things. These used to be such boring subjects when we joined, nobody would look at these numbers. I never found any economist rather ever interested in these numbers in those days. But now these numbers have taken a center stage, and all of us are really seeing the utility of these numbers. So that is one, and the same thing applies to unemployment data or the economic growth or the impact of these lockdowns and so many issues. Now, all of them is just now come out of the government area. Now, these are all being discussed in the journalist or what we call data journalism, which is available in all the channels now. So it's a good thing that data has come to really occupy the center stage. And it is in this view, being a government statistician, I am very keen to look at how the people like Abrood looks at the whole issues now, because we are trained and we have been spent the whole lifetime only collecting data. And we never saw this kind of a debate, which could have certainly improved the government machinery of collecting data if it had happened much earlier. But now a situation has come and the government is slightly, government has left out a lot of gaps now. The government has left a vacuum, especially in the question when it comes to data. And this vacuum is now being filled up by practitioners and the journalists, and also by universities now, like the Simpremji University. Only the day before they had inaugurated a data portal, or the Ashoka universities. All these institutes, research areas are actually filling up the vacuum that has been caused by the government's own disinterest or lack of interest or other issues in the area of data. So I'm very keen to listen to what Viru has to say as a development practitioner, and what his reflections are on the current state of things, the way as an outsider, how does he view the things, which will be of interest to all of us. And let me again congratulate the MP for taking up these issues. And I think this will continue. This is, this dialogue process will continue, and we'll have more people joining us in the coming days. And this material will also be available, in the YouTube, so for the researchers can also later on access it and use it for the purpose. So I will invite Dr. Abhirup Punia to start his presentation. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much, Mohanan sir. You are a veteran yourself, and I think the fact that I'm able to sort of state my views, in your presence itself increases the honor that much. I want to clarify, and this I had to clarify once before to Dr. Kumar as well, that I'm not a doctorate. So I'm a practitioner. So while it's flattering, it's factually incorrect. I will start sharing my slides, but before that, I want to, state a few things. One is, of course, when Dr. Kumar, invited me to sort of give this talk, I looked at the agenda and it did seem very pertinent. I work in the development space for people who are not in the development space. Essentially, they refer to it as social sector. So essentially, my domain is very much limited to one particular area where data and evidence matters. And
do we have a problem?
It froze. I will coordinate.
can you hear me? Sorry, the power just went up, and it's very typical these days in Delhi. Can you confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Because of rain,
Okay.
No problem. Please go ahead.
Yeah, as I was saying, yeah. So I think I'll just dive straight into my presentation now, and and then we can discuss. And I hope this fits into the overall agenda of your series, and it does at least some justice to it. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it's on. Yes. Yes, it's working. To change the slide bottom left.
Okay. So I will, yeah, fine. I'm getting a no worries. So the WDR, which I also had the opportunity to glance through, and I know I've sort of borrowed the terminology that WDR has used this time with respect to public intent data and private intent data, and which I liked particularly in terms of the conceptualization. So, one of the things that we often do in terms of while we support the paradigm of this, and if you look at, I mean, obviously the common picture of what one understands when they speak of data is basically a number, which is basically quantitative data. But then there is also qualitative data, which, and this is one of the centerpieces of my argument today, which adds value to the evidence generation process. And in my discussions with decision makers, I've often felt that it lends a certain meaning to them and it makes it actionable for them, rather than just saying, okay, here is the broad trend of coverage of schemes. This is what is happening on the ground in terms of some. So I've just tried to picturize what we broadly mean when we say evidence, at least in the public policy sphere. So, and the color shading, essentially what I want to say is that, we are already quite up there. And again, I want to emphasize, this is not the national, this is not the NSSO, unemployment, employment survey, not those kinds of work, but some of the micro level stuff that happens across states and districts in support of particular policy questions. So we are quite up there in terms of conducting quantitative surveys. My experience in traveling through the hinterland for monitoring these surveys have been that in fact there is quite an overdose of surveys. Often they're repetitive. They're obviously very quite costly an affair. And one of the things which has gained traction recently is administrative data. Again, this is something the WDR focuses on a little bit, but overall administrative data has taken center stage. And I want to sort of, through this talk, reiterate the potentials of existing administrative data, which is quantitative in nature, and also the importance of integrating more qualitative data into the evidence generation process to make it more meaningful and actionable. So I want to situate this whole debate. I don't dwell too much on private intent data, but in order to situate the conceptualization of how data and its meaning has changed, I want to also slightly talk on market research. Essentially meant you go and do surveys of people and ask them, what cigarettes do you like to smoke? Just as an example. But if you look at big tech and the paradigm of big data today, and if we take without taking any names of corporates, if you look at some of the big players in terms of in the big tech space, whether it is e-commerce space, whether it is digital financial services and so on, the amount of data that they have and the ability to actually use that data to feed us more and more tailored products is quite something, and it really lends credence to the idea that the same records data that is available in public space in a very different manner, if we tap into it more and more, I think there is a wealth of what you call latent evidence already available, but it's just a matter of synthesizing it and producing it as an evidence to support any kind of policy decisions. So administrative data, I want to discuss. I want to discuss a few features and traits of what administrative data looks like. Essentially, what we're talking about is there is, through the operation of various government schemes, programs which are very large in nature, And by virtue of the fact that this program exists, and by virtue of the fact that day after day these programs are implemented in the public policy sphere through its various touch points, without the intention to collect any data as such, there's a lot of records that essentially feed into a stack of data, which is essentially administrative data. Now, but then there are three main questions which I feel are important. One is the discoverability, which essentially how I conceptualize it as, is looking at that data and thinking whether this has the potential to generate any structured evidence for supporting policy. Once that potential has been discovered, I think there is a question of accessibility, which is that, one is the physical accessibility. That, sometimes the formats in which such data is available, and very rich data, access to that data, or sometimes it's a question of access to that data simply in the manner of how forthcoming any government department or even a particular, let's say, a district project management unit, how forthcoming are they going to be in terms of sharing that data to generate evidence. And in terms of data sharing, it's a huge debate. It's a very separate kind of a debate, data sharing, protocols, open data, and so on. I'm not, getting into that so much, but, my personal view here would be that I will not decry anybody who's saying that, I'm a little touchy about putting out all my data on a website. That is ideal perhaps, but, perhaps a more intermediate step would be that the data is available and on special, request by, let's say, a civil society member, researcher, agency, or any consultant who's working closely with the government, gets access to that data, to the full data, because sometimes what we have is we only have summary data. And then there's a question of quality. I'll come to that, but I also want to emphasize that, when we do surveys, there's a question of representation. I think with administrative data, that is almost achieved by default, because there is a nature of universality in terms of how these programs are implemented. I mean, obviously there is an eligibility criteria for a program or a scheme, but within that eligibility criteria, it is by definition quite fully represented, because it's everybody's data. We're not sampling. And then a big elephant in the room is perhaps the question of quality. And the biggest two questions of quality, to my mind, from my experience of looking at district and state level data, is the question of missing data or data which is available in unstandardized formats. So that makes it very difficult to sort of do anything. So the cleanup process may be there, but if data is missing, that's an entirely different complex scenario altogether. And this happens for a multiplicity of reasons. Yeah. So I'll just take an example, because this often eases out the general way in which we talk about things. So let's take the examples of, let's say, rural livelihood missions, which operate across many states. And let's take the example of self-help groups, which are basically the lowest unit in these rural livelihood missions. And many states, as we know, are sort of already looking at complete digitalization process, by which I mean that the entire process of bookkeeping is getting digitized. Sometimes it is digitized by nature. So, so one member of an SHG has a tablet and directly fill in there. But more often it's about taking the manual data from that khata or whatever the book and transferring it into a MIS system. So what this does is the digitalization actually encompasses not only regular operations data but also the transactions data. So one of the benefits this is that in terms of the eventually is that it's not a new process. Existing process is being leveraged and only digitized. So there is no new evidence or data architecture, investment, resources, to collect data. All of that stuff is not required at all. We are just leveraging an existing system and trying to see potential for evidence in that.
Some connection issues again. I will check.
Really sorry, I again got disconnected. But can someone please confirm that you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I mean, yes.
And I'm going to share my screen once again.
You can keep your camera off so that some while having screen.
Yeah, I think it's off. Yeah, it's off.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think what I was saying is that so on the evidence potential, I think using the example of SHG, what I'm trying to say here is that we all know how SHGs operate. They meet regularly. They're supposed to meet regularly. Then there's a process of interloaning. There's a process of regular savings. There's bank linkage, and so on and so forth. Typically, what happens is if we want data on financial inclusion, if we want data on rural micro enterprises, what we do is we try to think of conducting some kind of a primary survey. That is usually our first response when we think of generating evidence. But the very fact that all of this administrative data is available, I think inherently has an evidence generation potential, which there's a merit in at least moving the needle in terms of the discourse of the acceptability of administrative data. I also want to focus a little bit on the other potentials of such processes, which is that if you make the administrative data reliable, high quality, routine, and structured, there are other benefits to it. So for example, in this case, the one benefit that I can immediately think of is that it generates a reliable credit history, which is useful for banks and digital service providers as external actors to then leverage. I've mapped some indicative quantitative indicators on which we can potentially get reliable data if the administrative data ecosystem improves. So what are these things? We can get data on SH demographics. We can get data on their financial performance. What is the status of savings, interloaning? What are some of the reasons people are taking loans? What about fund receipts? So there's a revolving fund and a CIF that is that SHGs are supposed to receive. What is the status of fund received, utilization? If there is any anomaly on that, status of credit linkages with banks, history, transactions, even things like profiling of enterprises, what is the status of revenue, income, profits, even non-financial things like how frequently people are meeting. So there'll be timestamps, there'll be discussion topics, there'll be meeting frequencies will automatically be recorded, the duration of meetings will be recorded. When data is not available, you can make the conclusion that there is a question of functionality or non-functionality of SHGs. And then you will obviously get a lot of disaggregated data in terms of locational factors and other factors which might bear upon the performance of SHGs, for example. And this I've just used an example. It can be anything. It can be an Anganwadi centers. It can be about adolescent girls and whether they're getting take-home rations and so on and so forth. I wanted to, this is by design, I have put the slide once again here. So the other point that I want to make here is that is about primary qualitative data. But I want to settle the point on administrative data is that, administrative data has a strong potential, in my view, to complement the evidence ecosystem. There is no question of replacing one or the other, but perhaps there is a question of rationalization of primary data collection. Perhaps there's a question of thinking whether this data is available. But perhaps there's a question of thinking of ways to actually improve the system's own data, rather than saying, oh, obviously we know the MIS is really in bad shape. We know that HMIS is in bad shape. We know that perhaps the Manrega MIS is not giving us the real data. So as a reaction to that, often we tend to say, okay, then let's do a survey. But perhaps in terms of at least discourse, there should be more efforts towards thinking how do we actually improve the capacity, quality, strength, the quality assurance processes of the administrative data itself. And digitalization is just one of the many things that can be done in this. There is a whole question of, uptake of data, whether there is adequate demand, whether, there's a cultural shift in moving towards, having a real-time data generation, and so on and so forth. These are not low-hanging fruits, of course. Many of these are sort of very sticky problems. I'll talk a little bit about, because my whole proposition is how we can strengthen the evidence ecosystem. My second proposition really is that we need more research that is integrative of qualitative nuances. So to do that, really, we need to, there's a lot of open debates on this one, and I should have stated this at the very beginning. I don't claim to have all the answers, and neither do I intend for this talk to be the last word. What I really intend for this to do is, as a contribution to an ongoing conversation of what evidence-based policy should look like. So what is evidence really? Very commonly, when we talk about evidence, particularly in the context of monitoring and evaluation, is we want to see what works. So let's say there is a scheme which has been introduced, 5 years have gone past, and we want to see whether it did work. That's fair enough. Obviously that's a big part of it, but there are a few other things which are important. What are these? And these are slightly complex. So it's not just about whether something works or not, because the question then is whether we're looking at something working at an aggregate level. That is perhaps not the full picture. We need to understand why it did work, and if it did not, why it did not. Who did it work for? Are there people who are left out? Are there people for whom it did not work out? So averages obviously don't tell us the story. Under what circumstances did it work? And if at all there is a success story, what is the story behind it? What is the chain of impact, or what is known as the mechanism of impact? Is it really that straightforward that X happened and therefore there's an impact and therefore we should do X? So one of the things, in the discourse of realist approaches to evidence generation, many people have pointed out that we have certain imagery in our minds about what is a gold standard evidence. And without naming anybody or any particular entity or any particular method, I would like to say that evidence doesn't really operate in any bubble. There is a real political economy environment within which evidence has to operate. So the question of what is the evidence, is it timely? Is there demand for uptake? What are the competing interests and incentives which may, perhaps improve the uptake of the evidence, but also may, act as a barrier? There are questions of power dynamics, and there are questions of social norms. None of this stuff can actually be captured in numbers. That is a hard reality, which has been increasingly being accepted within the discourse on evidence generation. Now, let's take a hypothetical, there's a reason why I have said hypothetical in bold. It's actually very fictional. So let's say fortified take-home rations increase nutrition levels of adolescent girls in 5 rural districts in state S. And let's for a moment think that the evidence is that an intervention has worked because A, B, and C outcomes have been fulfilled by 10%, 12%, 15%, for example. And therefore, an automatic policy takeaway is assumed, which is to say that therefore perhaps X may be adopted, potentially replacing Y, which is already operational, which is already happening in state S. But then, what we have to understand that there is, the bridge that connects evidence and policy is actually very long, and there are many pitfalls which need to be sort of, what do you call, you need to jump over those. So what are those real world complications? And again, this is only fictional. So for example, there's a firm which is interested in manufacturing DHR packets, and there's a, so I'm thinking from the shoes of a policymaker who's sitting at the level of the state, for example. And then the questions which complicate this evidence are as follows. There's a question of investment, there's a question of employment, there's a question of what other interest groups are out there which might, be a determinant of whether that evidence really matters. What about local politics? What about the timing of the evidence? Is the evidence timed well to actually support a policy decision? Now, there are other complications. For example, there can be competing evidence, right? So for example, there's a decentralized model, which is led by SHGs, wherein locally, take-home rations are being procured, produced, and packaged. And there is evidence that this leads to women empowerment and economic opportunities at the very local and micro level. There is other competing evidence that suggests that perhaps these will have questions of quality. Potentially, they're unstandardized. And if one SHG is supplying to, let's say, 1 or 2 villages, then is there a question of potential, having the exact nutrient value differing as you move from one district or one village to the other? And it's an entirely fictional story, but my point is to drive home the scenario of how a real-world policymaking situation looks like. And it's really not about, that this is the data, look at this. A data can scream anything, but there are many other considerations that need to be taken into account while we eventually present an evidence piece, hoping to be influencing policy. Some of the real-world complexities are actually in the pathways to change also. So for example, information overload, it won't be right to assume linear pathways to change. So for example, you're saying there's an intervention X, and due to that, an outcome occurred. No matter how complicated and rigorous your designs are, the fact of the matter is there could have been n number of things that happened within that pathway to change, which is often called the black box of process. Secondly, there is the multiplicity of stakeholders. John Drays had written in this piece, critiquing, wouldn't you say critiquing, I mean, he was reflecting on the state of evidence. And he used the example of eggs, using eggs in midday meals, and the evidence that has a increases nutrition levels, which is a given, nothing new in that. But there are many complications when policymakers consider these things. There's complications of vegetarianism, there's caste dynamics, there's power dynamics, there's a dynamic of whether there is a poultry, lobby, so on and so forth. So multiplicity of stakeholders is important. So that needs to be understood. There are varying interests and incentives that actually operate within a given time. And therefore, I really want to reiterate that the evidence that we generate doesn't really operate in a bubble. Unless, of course, we are looking at strictly academic research, which is not even my forte. So I'm not going to comment on that. So there are many unknowns. In sum, there are many unknowns when we talk about evidence. Combining my two key points on firstly administrative data and then the requirement for primary qualitative data, I want to sort of try and see if I can summarize a few takeaways. Firstly, I would say when we talk of evidence generation, the first port of call need not be surveys. And there are many reasons for that. And, I've written about this before. The reasons include cost. They include the question of self-reported data, which may or may not be correct. There is the question of who in the household or the establishment is respondent in your survey. And then there are other operational questions, which is a survey takes time. You plan a survey, and even if you're planning a survey of 2,000 households covering 5 districts, it is a time-taking process. So timeliness is a factor in today's world if you're trying to influence policy through evidence. And there's a question of cost. There's a question of repetition. I've been to villages in particularly in North India, where there has been such an overkill of surveys conducted by various agencies, civil society organizations, researchers, so on and so forth, that, I wouldn't want to say, but the respondents really know why you're coming, and they really understand why you are there. And some of the questions, they are able to answer before you ask the question. And there is a question of respondent fatigue also. And these are operational questions, and sometimes people who design surveys perhaps don't know, but you speak to the field guys, they know it. Now, so therefore what? Therefore, what my sense is, and I have, in this entire presentation, I have not looked into existing research. What I've done is I've just dumped my reflections here. So my sense is that there is already a wealth of administrative data which is available, and there is merit in considering tapping. But then there are very valid questions about the quality and reliability of administrative data. But for that, the answer is not to switch to something else, but to actually try and think of ways to improve the administrative data. Now, those are the first 3 points really regarding administrative data and its potential. Then there is the question of what constitutes evidence. I would say it really needs to be situated within the real world policymaking context. And then there is a point about co-designing research processes geared to answer specific policy questions. Co-design is a buzzword which is often used. Working closely with governments, particularly at the state and district level, you realize that co-design is easier said than done, because you have to be patient and constantly iterating about what is the important policy question. It has to be a closed door conversation. It has to be a conversation where people feel free and open to talk about their concerns about data, to talk about what evidence matters, what evidence, even if it matters, cannot be considered. And what is an essential policy question which decision makers really want to know about and on which they can act. I think one of the things that we often do is that, and perhaps, looking at an ideal scenario, maybe we should be aiming for that. But we often think that, as researchers, if we collect high quality data, if we conduct rigorous analysis, we have done everything on our part, and it is now incumbent on the policymaker or the decision maker to consider that data. But as I have tried to mention, there are practical policy considerations which go beyond what the data says. Nobody really comes and says, let's look at the dashboard and say, okay, this is going wrong, let's fix this. There are many other considerations, to be honest. There are certain nuances, which really need to be captured if we are to lend meaning to the evidence that we are presenting to decision makers. So whatever be your primary data source, if it's a survey, it's a sample survey, it's an existing secondary database, it's administrative data, whatever it is, I think some of the complexities can only be untangled if you are going with an open mind, with a semi-structured or potentially open-ended checklist, and conducting some deep dives with important stakeholders. So, and because, just having household data and having overall trends and having experimental evidence to attribute a certain outcome to an intervention is not enough, because there are multiple stakeholders, views, perceptions, interests that need to be considered. And if we capture that within an evidence, then it just relates better to a decision maker. And then a person is in a better place to say, okay, this actually is optimal. It takes into consideration a multiplicity of views. It does not, it takes into consideration also through the co-designing process, the key interests of the decision maker in mind. And lastly, I think rather than surveys being the first port of call, what it should be, I think I again got disconnected, but can somebody please confirm that I'm back?
No, you are here. Yes.
Okay.
You can stop the share, then it will work better.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I had just one last point to make, if I'm allowed to.
Please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I think rather than having surveys as the first port of call, what is important, in my view, is to obviously consider primary service for its obvious strengths, which need not need any reiteration. But think about some of the following. One is the length of the question. I've seen questionnaires that go into hundreds of pages. It is quite laborious and torturous even for the respondents. I've often seen data sets where 40% of the variables are not even used in analysis. So rationalizing on your data collection, thinking of what variables are really useful, thinking of what data points perhaps are already available within administrative data, and thinking of what evidence quantitative surveys and data points will not be able to shed light on. So yeah, I mean, I think that was the last slide really. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Yeah.
Right. Abhi, you can have your video on.
1 second.
Yeah, it was not working earlier. Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, the power is off, so the video will be very bad in quality.
Okay, no issues. So now we'll go over to Mohan sir for his comments.
Thank you. It was a very wonderful or my experience in the data collection. Yes, you are right that the administrative data. Are you hearing me?
Sir, yes, sir, you are. Yes, sir, you are audible. Yeah.
It's a most valid point that the administrative data sets are highly underutilized in our country, and the need of the hour is actually to see how far and
The connection just dropped for sir.
okay,
Right.
okay.
So,
I was able to hear. Yeah.
Meanwhile, until sir joins, there has one question came from Rajeshwari Balasubramani ma'am. Can you please reflect on testimonies and narratives of field level staff as data and the quality of the same as a way to untangle the complexities? The MIS data also the next month by the 10th date, all that has to be updated. And then there is a lot of glitches in the data reporting part also. I think that is the question. If you want to take that, Mahima, do you want to add anything? Do you have any question, Mahima?
Yes. When you talked about the SHG's example and you were elaborating on the indicators, I know it's a hypothetical example, but do we have the infrastructure to collect such elaborate and vast data, and are they financially feasible in a country like India? Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks, Mahima. I'll take your question first because it's in the flow. So one of the things that I really want to emphasize on here is that the very fact that this is administrative data means that you are not making any additional effort, or you're not making any additional investment in resources, at least, in terms of collecting the data, because that data, as part of the governance of that scheme, is supposed to be available. Yeah.
I'm sorry, my connection went off. No, I had to come out of my house on my mobile.
No worries, we are on the same boat now.
Okay. I'm audible all right now.
Yes, sir, audible.
Yeah, perfectly.
You can enjoy the background of my village.
Yes, that's nice to see, sir.
Yeah, so what I was saying is that, there are some pitfalls in use of administrative data, because these were not intended for any used for research or any purpose. The ultimate objective of most of the MIS that is developed for these schemes is that they need a dashboard kind of thing, and they, every day evening somebody has to look at the dashboard and see the progress and things like that. And you will hardly ever find what we call metadata. I mean, we don't find any definitions. When you look at the dashboard, you only see the number. They don't even say on what date this is referring to. I mean, the numbers may change by next day, and you won't even know what is the reference date for the numbers, nor will you know the definition used for collecting this data or information. That is the biggest issue. For example, if government makes a database of migrant labor, we don't even know what is the definition of a migrant. In fact, that is what I currently in the discussion. Nobody has any idea about a migrant, but everybody wants a migrant database. So these are some of the issues. And as rightly pointed out, most of the time the researchers and the users, they don't have access to the micro data. I mean, the main database. What they access is the summarized aggregated data. So the need of the hour is to make this data available after sufficient anonymization so that individual's privacy is not given out. So we need a system where the government is more open in actually disseminating the MIS-based data or the project data, whatever they call, and ensure that these are anonymized but are available at the disaggregated level for use of that. And that should be the primary thing we should look for. And as Virup again mentioned, instead of running and racing for a survey, the first stage should be to look at all this administrative data and how best they can use it. The surveys are very expensive, very time consuming, though that appears to be, as you pointed out, the first option for most of the research project is to conduct a survey. But I know very well, having spent so many decades in the field, it is becoming more and more difficult. It is extremely costly. And then to collect qualitative data becomes a very difficult job. So I think there can be no doubt that the administrative data should be better utilized for our policy purpose and also for evaluation and other things. But people need to be much more careful when you're using this administrative data compared to a survey data. Survey data also has a problem unless the way it is collected or designed. But my own experience in administrative data is that it keeps changing without any intimation. Sometimes they suddenly change the definition of an MSME, and next year data will show something else. You will never know what has happened, and there will be no information about this kind of changes. But this is a good thing that we need to keep discussing these issues. I'm very happy about the points you have brought out. Now let us see whether the audience, whether there are any questions from our participants today. I think you can, Swati, you will take up that point. Are there any questions in your chat box? Or?
Yes, sir. Two questions have come. One was about the narratives of field level staff, those who are doing the data entry. And Mahima has also asked a question about the capacity and infrastructure facilities, especially at the ground level, so that the data is more periodic and reliable. Avirup, would you like to take those?
Yeah, I'll take it. First of all, thank you, Mohan sir, and complete agreement about the quality and reliability question. This is something that needs to be addressed. Mahima, I was responding to a question. Yeah, you said whether we have the adequate resources and capacity and infrastructure to collect the data. First of all, using the SHG example, because that's the one you pointed out, you don't have to collect any additional data more and beyond what is already required for you to be done as part of being a member of an SHG under a state rural livelihood mission. So in other words, what I'm saying is, so if you, and some of these reforms are already happening in the states of, I think, Andhra Pradesh, Jharkhand, and Chhattisgarh, but I may be wrong. We have to go and check, wherein you are actively looking at digitizing some of these data, which is, so, what happens in an SHG, you go there, there's rich data which is available in the SHG books that they maintain. And there's a designated SHG bookkeeper, as you know. They're supposed to maintain records of every meeting. They're supposed to maintain records of what they're discussing, the financial records, interloaning, bank linkages, passbooks, everything. So the moment you digitize, you're just transferring an existing manual physical stack into a digital stack. So there is no additional investment other than the technological investment. So for example, I think there's a concept of tablet Didi. I think it's in Jharkhand, where they're essentially giving out these tablets to a designated SHG bookkeeper, so the entire process gets digitized and it's at the back end it's integrated. So apart from the tech investment, I don't think there is any additional investment in resources or infrastructure or anything. So and because we have anyway moved to CAPI for now more than a decade now, where we conduct very large surveys, I think that infrastructure, I do not perceive that to be a problem. Yeah, large amounts of unstructured data may be a problem. Unstructured data in the sense that, having minutes of meetings, having that record, being able to analyze that, of course, those are problems. Yeah, I hope that answers
Thank
the
you, sir.
question.
Thank you. Sir. Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Right. On that SHG part, let me also add one question, Aviru, that when we look at this big data, MIS, and when we are trying to create some impact through policy, for SHG also we see that we have around, around 7 million SHGs, more than that, those who are registered and all. And last year also government introduced some credit and other things also, a marketplace for SHGs really. But then the penetration stops. The same incidence was there also in the health. When PMJ and other health centers, only 10,000 or so. So the number we see as overall 10,000, 15,000, it looks very fascinating. But time and again, only a few, the impact is being limited. How do you see the universe, the data which we are collecting and the impact we are being able to do in this process? How do you see this happening?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid question and a concern. I think obviously we are a few years away from that image, right? So the question really is of scale. From what I understand, the pilots are happening. The question is of scale, which is to say that at a massive scale, whether you will be able to have this high quality, reliable, routine administrative data, and particularly ones that are digitized and have some automated validations and quality. So I think the question really is a matter of scale now, and that is a function of, to my mind, three things. One is technology, reduction in costs in internet, and having the skills and capacity to actually implement such a vast project. Other than that, I don't see why, if something is, so that's the classic question of an RCP. If something is happening in a pilot, that the scaling up is a whole new ballgame altogether. But as a proof of concept, what I'm seeing, administrative data and its potentials are quite vast. But yeah, I agree with your point that, to be able to reach that coverage, I think we are still quite far away from that, and that needs technological investment. I think there are two questions. There are two. I just saw there are two questions. I think on the chat box.
I will take those. The webinar which Mohan sir was also referring, public data, which APU was conducting. There also, Professor John Gray has also highlighted the point which Aviru made. That our MIS system needs to be reliable and strengthened. Not that we need some more multinational or others coming and then producing data, because our statistical system is really good. So much so that before the pandemic also, our NSO and all the systems, even the surveys also, very important surveys which we do, they also said that within 6 months we will publish the data with all the validation and others. How do you see going ahead this changing in our national policy or evidence generation process? But before that, Arjun is here, Arjun Sujit Verma, and he's our researcher and also studies at Jindal. Arjun, quickly have your question.
Thank you, sir. Aviru, Dr. Aviru, it was great webinar. My question is basically, it refers back to this particular webinar that IMPRI had conducted, I think, earlier this month, where Pritika Hingorani at the IDFC Institute, they were mainly talking about urban planning and the ranking of indexes within the urban planning field. And she had mentioned this particular point of using satellite imagery to really get to of really looking at certain of deriving data. So what are your thoughts on that? I really agree that I really agree to the fact that the use of surveys are very costly and very time consuming. Like, how do you look at satellite imagery as an additional source for deriving data?
Right. Let me also frame this, that how do we see the use of GIS or location, even for all the toilets, all the PMAY, Awas also, we have that, but the penetration is 2%, 3%. I mean, one can never make use of those data. How do you see this advance going on also with our statistical system? Let me also add one question, which has come by anonymous attendee. Hello, do you have any recommendation for dissemination of Indian official statistical data as it suffers from issues of lag, fragmented availability? Do you have any suggestion for dashboard or other thing that how to disseminate this really quick? Because most of the time when data comes, a lot of debate happens. Then after various push, then people make it that okay, make it public and let researchers do their job. But the usability is very less. For example, the employment data. Government itself and Niti Aayog not acknowledging their own employment data, so we don't have any statistics. How do you see about the dissemination point and the use of technology, especially the GIS and the geotagging, as Arjun is also highlighting?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I'll take these questions. Arjun, I have to admit that, while I cursorily have engaged with the use of satellite imagery, and I'm not an expert, so I don't know whether generating those images or use of night lights and stuff like that really, to what extent it adds value. I'm sure it does, but I am not an expert in those areas, so I'll reserve my comment. But I have one larger point to make. Whether it is the use of satellite imagery, whether it is the use of drones, there's a lot that is being proposed and perhaps also being used. Whether it is, whether it is even looking at social media data and stuff like that. In theory, there is a lot of potential, but I feel like there needs to be a better use case. Obviously, the proof of concept is there, but I think the use cases need to be more varied for it to make a dent. But I mean, let us be honest about one thing. The pace at which technology has progressed in the past decade and is constantly progressing, let us be, I think we all have to humble in acknowledging one thing, that no researcher is able to predict the way in which a new technology will suddenly come up and dramatically change the way we do things, whether it is the way we work, whether it is the way we conduct surveys and stuff like that. So, whenever we use the word tech, I think it's very difficult for us to be ahead of the curve. We'll always be behind the curve as far as I understand it. And the only reliable way to gauge is if you see enough use cases of it being deployed and adding to the evidence base in a meaningful way for decision makers. Regarding Dr. Kumar's question on GIS geotagging, I think, your question, I mean, this is something that you previously asked as well about the coverage. There are two things. One is the usefulness of a certain innovation, and that is proven through a proof of concept. How much we are able to rapidly scale up and reach a point of universal coverage is obviously a question of not so much the design itself, but about the resources, investment, capacity to actually scale it up in a vast manner. So, in theory, as a matter of a proof of concept, obviously, it is great to have geolocations of toilets. And your question about the coverage is very valid. But, let's be honest, that question of coverage can be addressed in one fell swoop. If suddenly, someday, we have a technology which is much cheaper, which is much easily adaptable and, widely usable. So yeah, I mean, your question of scale is very valid, but that's a different ballgame altogether. Whether we have the money, investment, capacity, and resources to scale it up. But the question of admin data is that that wealth of data is already available. So there is no additional collection effort.
Right. Let me take this last question also, that what are some of the ethical consideration in data collection that the system in India are not able to adhere to? Can one standard be ensured globally, or does context have to be given relevance? For instance, should respondents be compensated for the time they spare for survey, etc.? So really digging into the quality aspect from the respondents' part, and what are the practices?
Yeah, I think quality is one aspect, and that is obviously something that's very important. But I think this question is more about the ethics bit. You know, whoever has asked this question, I really want to point out that this is a very valid question. Should respondents be compensated for the time they spare for surveys? Is a tricky question. I mean, see, we usually borrow our concepts from the West, and usually we do not have any, system of monetary benefits, for sparing time for a survey. And in fact, that is somehow seen as unethical. Whereas your question is in fact about whether that should be a practice, given the fact that somebody is actually spending a lot of time. And that is a sentiment that I agree with, particularly from my own experiences in the field, where I have seen a survey go as long as 3 hours for a person who's perhaps a, daily wage laborer. In the case of a woman, perhaps there are household chores to look up to because of existing social norms. I've seen 2.5-hour surveys of pregnant women. And to be honest, the ethical lines, how and where we draw it, really needs to be well thought through, particularly in the context of the fact that the people we actually survey, most of them, 3 hours lost is actually a monetary value lost. And for women, there are other complications and dimensions. I do not know the solution or the answer to it right now, whether we should be monetarily compensating. But I think one of the things that we must do, and I have tried to mention that in my presentation, is that let's just at least first make an attempt to rationalize our data collection. I have seen people say, we are going to the field anyway, let's go and collect this data. Anyway, we are going there, let's collect this data. Obviously, because there's a cost effectiveness value to it. So there's a value for money consideration. And so we are going to this particular village, there's a lot of cost involved. We are eventually targeting a household, and you have finally entered the household, you're finally established contact with the respondent. So why not collect all the data that we can? This is the sentiment that I've often heard. Yeah, but it's really a trade-off. I mean, I really don't have an answer, but perhaps we should be looking at rationalizing data collection for sure, and more respect for respondents' time. That is, and how we arrive to that, that must be, that is definitely a matter of discussion. But in terms of sentiment, I think in terms of at least principles, I agree that these are valid questions, right? So we cannot take for granted that a respondent is going to sit there and give 3-hour-long responses just because you want to conduct a survey. Let's be honest about it.
Right. Many of the private firms now also use it, that you have to do this survey within half an hour. A lot of things in that respect is also coming, but really tough to integrate in our whole structure. So thank you very much, Virup. Really, I think really these data discourses are really important to ponder upon. So with that, let me give the podium to Mohan sir for his concluding comments, so that we can wrap up this important deliberation.
Thank you, Dr. Arjun. This has been a very lively session, and I have seen, of course, it is slightly deviated from the original intention of Abru by going into the survey programs and methodologies. I'm very familiar with the topics we should not be providing so much time for the surveys. And unfortunately, we have this tendency of telephone surveys. Everybody thinks now that these telephone surveys are so easy, and there is a recommendation that all of us will start collecting data using telephone surveys. Now, telephone surveys is its own how good it is compared to a face-to-face interview. There are many issues. Abhiru stressed today, and I fully agree with that about the respondent being made to sit for so long. And because the survey designers have decided to collect as much information as possible on survey just because of the economy. So these are all issues to be, I think probably the dialogue continues like this. We can discuss in due course any of these things. Choice of issues when it needs reflections on the ecosystem. And the example, I think, is a very good institute. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mohan sir. So with that, we thank all of you for joining this deliberation, and formally on behalf of IMPRI Generation Alpha Data Center, Gen Alpha DC, thank you everyone for joining our special series, The State of Statistics, Data Discourses, and today's talk on practitioners' reflection on the data and evidence ecosystem by Mr. Abhiru Bhunia sir. Thank you very much for putting forth all your...
Yeah, I know you want to close, but let me just quickly also say thank you to everybody, Dr. Kumar, Mohan sir. So yeah, let me just take the opportunity to thank everyone for organizing it and for patiently hearing me out. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. And we also like to thank our chair, PC Mohan sir, for chairing this deliberation. Despite being connection issues, everyone participated. And thank you to all the participants and who joined here on Zoom and watched on Facebook Live, and later will watch at YouTube and listen on our podcast. And we do hope that you'll join on our future episodes of our series, The State of Statistics, #Data Discourses. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening, and please take care.